Sharing my mind maps for child language acquisition. And this is off the back of the previous video that I made sharing my child acquisition exam response, where I got 20 out of 20. And in this video, I'll be sharing my Lexis, grammar, phonology, and theories mind maps. So this section that I've got in my notebook is just for child language acquisition. And as you can see, there's a lot of content in there. And I'll try to touch on some of the things, but obviously I won't be able to go through everything because otherwise the video would be too long. But if there is anything else that takes your interest, do feel free to leave it below and I'll try my best to make a video on that. And again, this is only one section of my notebook that's on child language acquisition. I've got lots of different sections on different parts of the exam, different parts of the course, how to tackle it and things like that. So again, if there's anything that you're particularly struggling with, do comment below and I will try and get around to that. So without further ado, we can get started on the Lexis mind map. So with Lexis, this is just some of the advice that my teacher gave me. It's not necessarily a hard and fast rule, but it's some things to take into consideration. So she kind of advised us aiming for 1.5 to 2 pages on Lexis. Of course, that will change depending on your handwriting, whether you have bigger handwriting or smaller handwriting. So again, you need to obviously take that into consideration. You don't necessarily have to do an introduction for this response. You can just get straight into it. And you want to kind of aim for 4 meaty paragraphs on Lexis, phonology, meanings, and grammar. And it's 20 marks. My teacher recommended doing it last. I don't think I did it last. I think I might have done it first. Again, whatever's more comfortable for you, aim for that. But I do think this final point is quite important. So try and sort of back every observation up with a theory. So try not to kind of do a standalone paragraph on theories. Instead, kind of try and incorporate that into your response, just so it comes across as a little bit more kind of intelligently and thoughtfully synthesized. So we can get started, first of all, with this idea of stretching words, which is a theory that is posited by Rascala. And this kind of extension is something that Rascala talks about. So overextension is when the child over applies the word. So for example, the child might have lots of different types of fruit in front of them, like apples, pears, melons, but they're not necessarily able to individually identify this is an apple, this is a pear, this is a melon. They refer to all of it as fruit, right? And that's categorical overextension. So for example, using fruit for all the apple, the melon, the pear, rather than specifically saying what it is. Analogical overextension is where a child refers to, for example, a scarf as a cat or a cat as a scarf because of the function or the perception of the object. So the child might perceive the scarf and the cat to both be fluffy and soft and comfortable. And so they sort of apply analogical overextension and kind of, again, interchangeably use those words. And then there's a third type of overextension, which is known as mismatch, and that's where a child uses language to convey some sort of abstract information. So, for example, the child points to a cot and says doll. And then there is this idea of underextension, so that's under applying words where a child can refer to milk in a cup as milk, but if they were to see milk in a picture book, they wouldn't be able to recognise and identify it. And again, just to kind of provide you with some technical language. So the overall kind of category, the umbrella, which in this case is fruit, is the hypernym. So that's the overall category. And then the individual kind of objects, so the apple, the banana, the pear is the hyponym. So this is kind of the broad overall kind of overarching umbrella category. And then you've got sort of the sub kind of objects in there, which are the hyponyms. Right. And then obviously moving on to hollow phrases. So hollow phrases are single words that children use to express a complete meaningful phrase in different situations. So obviously adults would be able to say, please, can I have some juice? Or I'd like to drink some juice. But children aren't able to necessarily construct those complete sentences. So they use hollow phrases to convey what they want, and they just use basically a single word to kind of express what they want in different situations. And this kind of links to Nelson's theory that the first 50 words that a child uses and knows are mostly nouns, right? And Nelson does say that actually a child knows a lot more words than they are able to actually say. So a child can produce fewer words than they understand, which means that in their mind they know a lot more words, but they're not able to necessarily say all of those words to physically pronounce those words. But in their mind, they're able to understand more words than they can form. And so lexical development is a child's acquisition of words, whereas semantic development is a child's acquisition of the meanings that are associated with those words. And here we've got sort of the rate of acquisition, which is some sort of important landmarks or milestones to be familiar with. So at the end of the first year, the child will begin to speak. At 18 months, the child will have a vocabulary of about 50 words. At 2 years, the child will have a vocabulary of about 200 words, and then there's an explosion at around 5 years where the child will have a vocabulary of 2,000 words before moving on to a vocabulary of 4,000 word at 7 years of age. And this is kind of helpful where if you're looking at text and you've got a child that's around maybe the 18th month mark, the 20-month mark, and you're kind of looking at their vocabulary, and they're using a lot of nouns, and they're using sort of limited, their vocabulary is around kind of that 50 word mark, and it's a lot of nouns. You would be able to say this is in keeping with Nelson's theory that that the first 50 words that a child uses are mostly nouns, and that the kind of at around 18 months a child is able to produce on average around 50 words, and they would acquire more words as they progress with age. And then moving on to this idea of building meanings. So Aitchison posited this theory that children acquire words and their meanings in 3 stages. So the first stage is labeling objects. The second stage is packaging, so that's working out that a cat is not a dog, or a dog is not a rabbit. So that's packaging. And this is where overextensions and underextensions happen. So the children might understand what makes a cat different to a snail or a rabbit. And then you have sort of network building, and that's starting to realize that words have opposites, so hot and cold, tall and short. And they realize that words have synonyms, and they're able to understand categories such as hypernyms and hyponyms, which we referenced earlier, and grammatical function. So this is you'll often notice that when children are learning to speak, there's often words that are missing in early speech. So like things like conjunctions, articles, auxiliary verbs. So they might say me hungry, or me eating food, rather than saying I am feeling hungry, or I am eating food. So those kind of grammatical function words are often not seen in early speech. And it's also good to keep in mind the context, obviously, of the conversation. So, what is the overall topic that's being discussed? Do the words that the child is using come from a particular field? And what is the purpose of the conversation, which we'll touch on a little bit later on as well. Then, in terms of grammar, um, obviously, we've got quite a few stages in grammar, which is kind of a nice way to break things up. So, we've got stages here, we've also got stages for how children learn negatives, and also stages for how children learn questions. So first of all, in terms of stages, so you've got the holophrastic stage, and obviously we talked about holophrases in Lexis. So as you might sort of be able to kind of infer from that, the holophrastic stage is where children use one word to signify a complete sentence. So they might, again, like we mentioned previously, they would say things like juice if they want to drink juice, or coat if they want to wear their coat. And as soon as you have more than one word, you have grammar. And then you have the 2 word stage, which comes at around 18 to 24 months. And that's where children use words in combination like more milk and me go. And the intonation is quite important. So obviously, if they're asking questions, so to ask their mother whether she's coming with them, or if obviously they're kind of using an exclamative and commanding and telling their mother to come with them. And then obviously you've got the telegraphic stage, so that's sort of around 24 to 36 months, and that involves 3 and 4 word utterances. And again, grammatical function words are mainly missing, so things like the, in, on, a. So a child might say, I eat cake, mummy, cake, all gone. And they're missing, am, which is the auxiliary, ing, which is the inflectional ending, the, which is the definitive article. And again, so the red is sort of the missing words that they're not yet using. And the child at this stage, telegraphic stage, will start to use more questions and commands, and they have quite a rapid progression because they're exposed to lots of new vocabulary and the brain is growing. Um, and then in the post-telegraphic stage, which is 36 months onwards, the speech will expand to include auxiliaries and prepositions and articles. So, for example, Ben is sad because we broke his toy. So again, they're using the auxiliary verb is. They've obviously got the correct tense of broke. His, so that's the correct pronoun, and obviously that's a possessive pronoun. And here, so it says cause. So the connective is obviously shortened rather than saying because, they say cause, and that's a sociolect that the child is copying. So again, they'll look at their caregivers and their parents, and if they are using a certain sociolect or dialect, the children will often kind of mimic that. And the pronoun usage will become more secure. So often when children are younger, they will refer to themselves in the third person. So Kim want juice or Kim want apple, because their parents will refer to them and call them, right? They'll say Kim come here or Kim do this. So the child will refer to themselves in the first person. In the third person. But later on, when the pronoun use becomes more secure, they will be able to refer to themselves in the first person, and they'll be able to say I want juice. So again, that's another sort of signal indicator of them kind of moving across these stages. Then it comes to the acquisition of inflectional endings. So Brown discovered that children between 20 to 36 months acquire these inflectional endings in a set order. So the first inflectional ending that children acquire is the ending ing, so I am going, and that's one of the first suffixes that children add. Then they acquire the plural s, so I see dogs. Then they acquire the possessive s, so Teddy's chair. And then it will be articles like a and the, so get the ball. And then it's the past tense, so I walked. But there are exceptions to the rule. So they will say things like maybe I runned, I swimmed, I eated, instead of I ran, I swam, I ate. Um, and when a child, when a grammatical rule is overextended, it's called overgeneralization. So obviously we talked about over and under extension previously, when it comes to Lexis, but when it's in grammar, when they kind of overextend this rule and they use it in this context, and obviously they don't use the exception, but they just kind of extend this rule, that's known as an overgeneralization, specifically in this context of grammar. Then children will sort of acquire the third person singular verb ending s, so he loves me. And then they'll acquire, lastly, the auxiliary verb be, so it is raining, and the different sort of situations to use that in. Now, these, according to Cruttenden, are learnt in three stages. So these inflectional endings are acquired in three stages. So first, children will have inconsistent usage of rules, so they'll use those rules inconsistently. Then they'll kind of use them more consistently, but they'll have some misapplications. You'll see a lot of overgeneralization, as we mentioned here. So ran, runned, and they'll misapply the hard rules. Whereas in stage one, they're inconsistent even with the easy rules. So that's what distinguishes it. Okay, so in stage one, even when it's the easy rules, they're not consistent. Stage two, the easier ones, they're a bit more secure, but they'll sort of misapply when there's the harder rules. And then stage three, they have consistent usage and they can cope with irregulars and exceptions. Then moving on to negatives. So this is a theory that was proposed by Belugi and McNeill, and they said that negatives are learnt in stages, and they kind of start with gestures. So children might sort of wag their finger and sort of to show no, no, no. But then around sort of 15 to 18 months, the child is using no and not. So no bed, no light car. Then at stage two, which is between 24 to 36 months, they use no mid sentence. And they can also use auxiliary and modal verbs. So I know want milk, I can't catch you. And can't and won't aren't always used correctly in this stage. So they might say I can't want that rather than I don't want that. So they'll make mistakes here at this stage. And then from the ages of kind of 3+ onwards, it's more standardized. So they use words like don't and can't correctly. They can use the word didn't, and they develop the use of isn't later on. So, for example, mummy isn't here. That'll come later on. And then when it comes to questions, that follows a similar pattern to negatives. There's three stages. So the first stage is the two-word stage that comes around 18 months, where there's a rising intonation. So me sit or go walk. And then sort of the second stage is between 24 to 36 months, and that's telegraphic speech, where they're still using rising intonation, but they also start using words like why, where, what, who. Um, so, for example, where tractor or what mummy doing? And then from the ages of 3+ onwards, they'll kind of develop subject verb inversion. So, can I see it or did she break it? So that's essentially the grammar section complete. And this is a theory that was done by Burke, where he said, and again we'll come back to this later on because it links to another concept that's mentioned later on, but Burke says this is a wug, and obviously a wug is a made up word, it's not a real word. And then children between the ages of 3 and 4 years were able to say there are two wugs. And this kind of demonstrates, this is kind of shown to demonstrate the theory of innateness. Because the child has internalized the rules. The child their child is not imitating their caregivers, because wug isn't a real word that they would hear. It's a rule that they've internalized and that they're able to use. So it's kind of supporting Chomsky's theory of innateness. And then moving on to the phonology mind map. So here are Schreiberg's, early, middle, and late eight sounds that you kind of just have to learn, really. There's not much to it. It's just as it is on the page. And then here are just some definitions. So vowels are sounds that are made without closure. So A, E, I, O, U. A diphthong is a vowel where you hear a change in sound. So brain, shame. Plosives, airflow is blocked for a brief time. So B, D, G, T, P, and K. Fricatives, airflow is partially blocked. So thy, leisure, thigh, ship. A fricative is a plosive and a fricative together, so judge and church. Approximants are similar to vowels, so W, J, R. Nasals are produced by air moving through the nose, so M and N. And lateral, so that's where the tongue is on the roof of the mouth, for example, the letter L. Now, children will simplify pronunciation in various ways. So they'll do a consonant cluster reduction. So instead of saying green, they'll say geen. So because G and R, that's a consonant cluster. So they'll drop the R. And then for screwdriver, for example, again, the S and the C and the R is a consonant cluster. So they'll drop something to get crewdriver. That's consonant cluster reduction. Deletion. So often they'll delete words at the end of the word. So instead of saying cat, they'll say ka, or they'll just drop kind of delete at the end of the word. Substitution. So a child might replace one sound with an easier one. So instead of saying legs, they'll say wegs. And that's quite common with the letter L because it's one of the last kind of sounds that they acquire. So again, if you were to see this in a text and you were to see some kind of substitution, you might, obviously, if you remember Schreiberg's sounds and you think, okay, well, they've dropped the letter L, and you'd say this is in keeping with the fact that L is a latate sound, and this child is, for example, if you've got a 3-year-old child, and say this child is 3 years old, and they're yet to develop the sound of the letter L, and therefore you can see substitution in action. So addition is adding a vowel at the end of a word. So instead of saying dog, they say dogu. And then again, that's something to do kind of with the playfulness of the child. And then assimilation. So for example, tub and bub, and that makes it easier to pronounce because the sound is already in the word. And then reduplication. So that's repetition of the same word. So bick bick, and again, that's something that children do when they're often playing. And what else kind of could you analyze? So you could analyze kind of the tone, the stress, repetition, imitation, grunts and murmurs and sounds that the child makes, and intonation as well. And that sort of develops later. So Crittenden says that it takes until age kind of 7 to develop. But again, these are all kind of things that you could consider and discuss, particularly, in terms of emotions, if they're feeling happy, sad, angry, and how their tone and which words they're kind of stressing. So the FIS phenomenon, which kind of was demonstrated by Burke and Brown, again links back to this idea. So this was the experiment that was done by Burke and Brown to kind of link back to this idea that children understand more words than they're able to produce, right? So the child said a FIS because the child has immature pronunciation, they're not yet able to pronounce things. So again, so is a sound that comes to them later on. It's a late sound. So the child is saying a FIS, and the adult says, "Is this your FIS?" And the child says, "No." Then the adult says, "Is this your fish?" And the child says, "Yes." So it's showing that the child can understand mentally that it's supposed to be fish. That's the correct word, but they're not able to say that word for themselves. And so when the adult is copying them and saying fist, the child is saying no, because the child knows that that's not the correct word and that's not what they're trying to say. They're just struggling to say it. So when the adult says that word correctly, then the child says yes and they agree. And again, if you were to see this in a text, you would kind of link back to the fact that, it's a latate sound, therefore that's why they're struggling. But they can actually, understand more than what they're able to say. And then here we've got a lovely page on theories. And so again, theories are quite important, and try and sort of kind of remember these. And they'll come quite easily generally because most of them are not that difficult. They are kind of straightforward. And again, try to incorporate them as you're going through. So here is a cognitive theory. So Piaget's importance of mental processes, where Piaget kind of says that children have to develop certain mental abilities to acquire language. At first, a child can't comprehend something outside their immediate surroundings, and that's called egocentric. However, by 18 months, a child will gain object permanence. And object permanence is the idea that, so if you were to have a very young child, and you had a teddy bear in front of them, for example, and you were to take that teddy bear away from them, and if that child had not yet developed object permanence, they wouldn't understand that the teddy bear can still exist if it's not in front of them. If it's not in front of them and you take it away, they'll just think it doesn't exist. It's not in their sort of mind. However, as a child gets older and they develop object permanence, um, even when that teddy bear is taken away from them, they'll know that it exists. They'll know that it is somewhere, even if they can't see it. Right. So that's what object permanence is. Um, once a child gains object permanence, there'll be a massive increase in their vocabulary, and they'll start to understand abstract things like the past, the present, and the future. So another thing to kind of look out for is children talking to themselves or trying to make sense of something, children failing to use or understand language because they haven't yet understood a concept. So behaviorism, so Skinner kind of talks about imitation and reinforcement. So children repeat what they say and they get rewarded for it. So when a child's, sort of first starts talking and using speech, their caregivers, their loved ones get really excited. They start clapping and cheering, and so that child realizes that they're getting rewarded for this, and they kind of want to keep doing that. And children can construct things that they've never heard before. Um, so, for example, obviously, it doesn't necessarily, however, explain overgeneralizations, like grammar rules, so run. So obviously, that's not something that adults will. So we've talked about this idea of imitation, that children imitate their caregivers. However, their caregivers wouldn't necessarily say words like "I runned" or I swimmed." Right? They wouldn't say that. But the child still overgeneralizes. So again, this is an idea that kind of my teacher did introduce to us, that you've kind of got to have a critical approach and don't be kind of hesitant to criticize the theory. In fact, it kind of shows that you are thinking critically to say, actually this is a limitation of Skinner's behaviorism theory, and here are some kind of alternative theories and ideas. And there are obviously shortcomings in this theory, because obviously adults don't say things like "I swim" and "I run," but the child still says those things. So yeah, there are obviously going to be limitations to the theories that exist, obviously, because we don't know everything yet. So what to look out for? So adults explicitly labeling words and children repeating them, children imitating, and again things like accent and sociolect and dialect that could link, however, to Skinner's theory of behaviorism. Then there's innateness. So obviously Skinner talks about behaviorism, Chomsky talks about innateness. So he says that we have an innate knowledge of the structure of language, right? And McNeill talks about this language acquisition device. And again, so the evidence for this is the Wug experiment. So, like I mentioned, Wug isn't a real thing, but children will say, they'll know that there are two Wugs instead of one. So they understand this idea of plurals and they're able to apply that rule. So that kind of strengthens Chomsky's theory of innateness. So what would you look out for? Things like overgeneralizations, overextensions, for example, calling all women mummy, and children making up names for things, children forming utterances that they haven't heard before. So that's this idea that they have an innate knowledge of the structure of language. They're not necessarily hearing that, but there's something that they're coming up with. Um, and then sort of moving on to this idea of interactionism. So there's a social interaction input theory. So Bruner came up with a language acquisition support system, or LAS, which is that support is provided by parents, friends, schools, nurseries, and that there's a clear pattern between the child and the caregiver in everyday social situations. So, for example, morning, mealtime, bedtime, bath time. And children that are deprived of this relationship don't seem to acquire language in the same way. So Lenenberg is a theorist who showed that there's a critical period before the age of 6, and in that critical period before the age of 6, that child develops most and a lot of their language by interacting with their caregiver, which is often the mother, right? So children who don't have that caregiver and who don't have that support system will have much kind of weaker vocabulary and weaker kind of language acquisition. And this kind of links to this idea that Clark Stewart kind of found, where he said that children whose mothers talk to them more have a larger vocabulary. And several researchers found that parents respond to truth values rather than grammatical correctness. So parents want their children to kind of be honest and be truthful rather than having the correct grammar, because that kind of, parents kind of think, oh, that'll come anyway, but they want their children to have kind of good values, if that makes sense. So what are we looking for in the data? So we're looking at the parent and the child during interactions, the adult using child-directed speech. So child-directed speech, which we'll come on to in a second. Often, you might hear like baby talk, so they're kind of uh, using kind of simpler words and changing their tone and their pitch and things like that. Parent reaching conversational skills and politeness, and the adult providing the last, which is the language acquisition support system. So, child directed speech, aka motherese or caretaker language or baby talk, although I would recommend that you kind of use child directed speech because, again, um, mothereses are just presumptuous of this classic idea that it's just mothers that are caregivers, or that it's just mothers that are parenting children. But that's not necessarily the case. So, child directed speech is a more kind of inclusive term for everybody. And I think it's something that examiners would prefer and probably recognise more as well. But again, in child directed speech or baby talk, um, you know, in the phonology, the intonation is stretched. So there's a high pitch that people use for children. And that's often kind of that kind of cringy kind of thing that you might see between lovers, particularly kind of maybe, teenage lovers, or in fact, quite sadly, people kind of use that pitch for older, incapacitated, elderly individuals who might be ill. And the words are repeated, the pace is slower, there's more pauses. Lexis of the vocab is often simplified. So from banana, they'll say nana, and they'll reduplicate. So it's choo choo and moo moo, and they'll use diminutives to things like birdie and fishy, right? So they'll have diminutive language. And lots of words are objects to be seen and touched. So they'll use a lot of words, a lot of nouns, because that's easier for a child to comprehend. So, if you're using words like book and cup and glass and pointing to those things, it's a lot easier for the child to understand rather than using abstract language and ideas and philosophical feelings that the child can't necessarily grasp at that age. And grammar, so the function words are left out. So Annie go for a walk instead of Annie is going for a walk, or let's go for a walk, Annie. And proper nouns are frequently used, and the child's proper name is used a lot. So is Annie making a sandcastle? So again, this kind of links to that idea of the child using the third person to refer to themselves, because that's how their parent refers to them. And again, you sort of parents kind of use certain techniques to encourage and develop conversation. So they'll repeat certain structures. So Annie got the tractor, Annie find the bottle, Annie go to bed. So they'll use those reliable structures that the child can recognize. And they'll ask lots of questions and use lots of imperatives. So let's do this, or put this away, or let's have bath, right? And the parent will often recast information, so which means that they represent the information in a different way. So the mum is saying, "What are you doing, Annie?" And the child says, "Playing with." And mum says, "Yes, that's your car." So affirming the information and then expanding, which means that they're giving extra information. So yes, you're playing with your friend. So the child isn't necessarily able to say all this, but the parent will kind of chip in and they'll recast and expand, so that child's vocabulary and understanding is growing because their parent is kind of scaffolding and providing that support for them. Um, However, again, as we mentioned, thinking about kind of the limitations of theories, some cultures don't actually have CDS, and children will still learn to speak. And research has produced conflicting findings. But obviously, Clark Stewart said that mothers who speak more to their baby have children with high vocab. But again, in some cultures, the mother might speak to the child, but she might not necessarily have child directed speech. She might talk normally. So again, like it's not necessarily universal, but it's obviously a helpful theory to have. And then this is kind of quite a useful thing to talk about, because you can realistically talk about this in any kind of any text that if you were given, or any script that you were to be given in any exam, you could apply this theory by Halliday to any text, right? Because it looks at what motivates a child to speak, and there are lots of different things, and inevitably one of them will fit with the text that you're given. So heuristic language is language that is used by a child to find out more about their environment. So where boat go or where mummy gone, right? So that's a child finding out about their environment. Imaginative language is child using language to create an imaginary world for comedic effect or for their entertainment. So I unicorn, I princess. Interactional language serves the purpose of relationship forming. So for example, Nana, me love you. So that's kind of strengthening those relationships. Representational language is used to convey information, so that red car or that big horse. Instrumental language is used to express the child needs, so I want milk or I'm hungry. And then regulatory language is used to tell others what to do, so come here, sit down, play with me. And then personal language is used to express feelings and opinions, so I sad or I happy, right? And then this is just like a little acronym that I kind of made up to try and remember um, all the different kind of motivations or functions of language, because as I mentioned, this is a really nice one to have in your back pocket, and just because any text that you get, obviously when any conversation is being had and the child is speaking, there will always be a purpose to why they're talking, even if it's just to have fun and just to play, that would be imaginative. Or again, if it's just building those relationships, it's interactional. And this is so it's a good theory by Halliday to, and again, that's why I always write about Halliday, because our teacher kind of drilled that into us. It's a really easy one that you can kind of always apply in any context and kind of get those marks. So yeah, so that concludes this kind of section for the mind maps. And then here kind of I have some sort of pages from a textbook that my teacher kind of shared with us. So I'm just going to sort of, it's quite straightforward. So I'll just kind of scroll through and feel free to pause and read at your own leisure, because again, it's quite kind of straightforward. And it just has sort of more sort of key terms and kind of features that you can use and apply in your own exams. Yeah, and this is a little bit more about kind of over and under extension, which we discussed earlier on. This is from an AQA textbook rather than OCR, but it's really helpful kind of theoretical knowledge, because um, it can, again, it's having these definitions that you can use either way. So again, this idea of labeling, packaging by HSIM, and then this is kind of a nice PowerPoint on lexical and semantic development. So it's kind of just again reiterating some of the points that I had written earlier, but in, I guess, a clearer format where it's typed out rather than my handwriting. So again, it's just about extending words and sort of the ages around that and Aitchison's theory. So that concludes today's video for child language acquisition. I hope you found that helpful. I'll try and leave a link in the description for a guide that I think was really helpful. And again, if there's any other things that you'd like to see or questions that you have, please feel free to drop them below in the comments, and see you for the next video.